Putin promised Russian mothers their sons would only fight for a few weeks, a quick special military operation to liberate Ukraine. Instead, he's fed over 1 million Russian soldiers into a meat grinder that shows no signs of stopping. And now, Russians are finally fighting back. Not against Ukraine, against Putin himself. Soldiers are refusing orders and surrendering en masse. Military wives are staging protests outside the defense ministry. Even Putin's own mercenaries have marched on Moscow with guns drawn. The rebellion is spreading faster than Putin can contain it. About 64% of Russians now want peace talks immediately, the highest number since the war began. Soldiers are shooting themselves in the legs to escape the front lines. Entire units are deserting rather than face Ukrainian forces. And here's the thing Putin never saw coming. This isn't about politics or ideology. It's about survival. Russian mothers are done watching their sons come home in body bags for a war that makes no sense. Russian wives are done being widows for Putin's ego. Russian soldiers are done dying for a cause they don't believe in. What you're about to witness is the story of how Putin's war is destroying Putin's Russia from within. Because when you send 1 million men to die for nothing, eventually even Russians say enough is enough. Let's break down exactly how Putin's glorious war turned into the biggest military disaster in Russian history since World War II. 1 million casualties. Let that sink in for a moment. According to Western intelligence estimates and independent Russian sources, Putin has managed to kill or wound over 1 million Russian soldiers in just 3.5 years of fighting. That's roughly 250,000 dead and 750,000 wounded. Numbers so catastrophic they dwarf every Soviet and Russian conflict combined since 1945. To put this butchery in perspective, Russia has lost 5 times more soldiers in Ukraine than in all Russian and Soviet wars combined between World War II and 2022. The decade-long Soviet war in Afghanistan, about 15,000 dead. The brutal Chechen wars, some 25,000 in total. Putin managed to exceed all of that in his first 6 months alone. But here's what makes these numbers even more shocking. Putin is achieving virtually nothing with this massive sacrifice of human life. Since January 2024, Russian forces have been advancing at an average rate of just 50 meters per day in some sectors. That's slower than the British and French advance during the World War I Battle of the Somme, one of history's most notorious examples of pointless slaughter. Think about that. Putin's modern army, with all its supposed technological advantages, is moving slower than soldiers armed with bolt-action rifles and bayonets over a century ago. And the cost? According to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Russia has seized less than 1% of Ukrainian territory since January 2024. They've traded 1 million casualties for roughly 5,000 square kilometers, an area slightly bigger than the state of Delaware. NATO officials report that Russia was losing approximately 1,200 soldiers killed or wounded every single day during May and June 2024. By November, that number had climbed to 1,500 daily casualties. On the bloodiest day in November 2024, Russia lost 1,950 men, more than the average daily birth rate of Russian males. Let me repeat that. Putin was killing more Russian men per day than Russia was producing. But wait, you haven't heard the most damning part yet. Remember March 2022, just weeks after the invasion began? Putin stood before television cameras and made a solemn promise to Russian mothers. No conscripts will be sent to Ukraine. Only professional contract soldiers would fight his war, he assured them. That promise lasted exactly as long as Putin's prediction of a quick victory. By summer 2022, raw 18 and 19-year-old conscripts were being coerced into signing military contracts and shipped straight to the Ukrainian front lines. These weren't hardened professional soldiers. They were teenagers who had been drafted for mandatory military service and suddenly found themselves facing Ukrainian artillery. The stories that emerged were heartbreaking. Young men calling their mothers from trenches, begging for help. Families discovering their conscript sons had been declared volunteers and sent into combat with just days of training. One mother told Russian media in late 2023, "We are horrified because we don't want to fight. They're just kids." Another wrote, "Why are conscripts being deployed for the special operation? It's the state's duty to bring them home alive and well. But Putin's war machine was hungry for fresh meat, and it didn't care about the age of the soldiers feeding it. In 2024, independent Russian outlet Mediazona documented that Russian military courts had prosecuted over 10,000 cases of soldiers refusing to serve, nearly double the number from the previous year. And that's just the ones who got caught and prosecuted. The real number of soldiers saying no to Putin's war is likely 10 times higher. Because here's what Putin never expected. When you ask people to die for nothing, eventually they stop volunteering. But the most shocking rebellion wasn't happening in the courtrooms or the barracks. It was happening on the battlefield itself. Meet Ukraine's I Want to Live hotline, probably the most successful Ukrainian weapon in the entire war. This simple phone number and website, designed to help Russian soldiers surrender safely, has become Putin's worst nightmare. By early 2024, over 26,000 Russian soldiers had contacted the hotline looking for a way out of Putin's meat grinder. The website had been visited tens of millions of times, with the vast majority of those hits coming from inside Russia itself. Think about what that means. Russian soldiers, sitting in their barracks or trenches, were secretly researching how to surrender to the enemy rather than fight for their own country. And they weren't just thinking about it, they were doing it in record numbers. In August 2024, over 100 Russian troops surrendered simultaneously during a single Ukrainian operation in Kursk, one of the largest mass surrenders of the entire war. Ukrainian forces reported that the Russian soldiers simply dropped their weapons and walked toward Ukrainian positions with white flags. Their commanders had fled, leaving them to face Ukrainian forces alone. But mass surrenders are just part of their story. Russian soldiers have gotten creative about avoiding Putin's war. In 2023 and 2024, dozens of Russian paratroopers deliberately shot each other in the legs and arms to earn medical evacuations. They'd rather face friendly fire than Ukrainian fire. Others simply vanished. According to Russian military records, nearly 16,000 criminal cases for crimes against military service, including going AWOL, have been opened against Russian troops since the invasion began. Last year, a record of 20,040 petitions were filed to declare soldiers missing or dead. And in July 2024 alone, Russian military courts processed over 1,000 new desertion cases in a single month. The Russian military response has been predictably brutal. Deserters face up to 10 years in prison. Some units have started tying suspected deserters to trees and leaving them for Ukrainian drones to find, a practice captured on multiple videos circulating on social media. But even the threat of execution isn't stopping the exodus. Why? Because Russian soldiers have figured out something Putin refuses to admit. This war is unwinnable, and they're tired of dying for his delusions. One Russian serviceman summed it up perfectly. I don't want to die here. It's not my war. It's not our war. I don't understand what the hell we are doing here. That sentiment is spreading through Russian ranks like wildfire, and it's not just the soldiers who are fed up. June 3, 2024, outside the Russian Defense Ministry in Moscow. A scene that would have been unthinkable 2 years earlier. About 20 Russian women kneel on the sidewalk, holding handwritten signs, "Bring my mobilized husband home. Enough of this war." Some have brought their children, toddlers holding signs that read, "Please bring Papa home." These weren't professional protesters or opposition activists. These were ordinary Russian wives and mothers, the same women Putin had counted on to support his war, and they were publicly demanding an end to the slaughter. The protest was organized by a grassroots movement called Putin Domoy, the way home. Their Telegraph channel has over 37,000 followers, mostly women whose husbands, sons, and brothers were swept up in Putin's September 2022 mobilization and never allowed to return home. The irony was devastating. Putin had declared 2024 the year of the family in Russia. Yet here were Russian families begging him to return their fathers and husbands from his war. One woman, identified as Paulina, captured the bitter absurdity. Why is it the year of the family and I don't have a husband? It's like mockery or taunting. Maria Andreeva, one of the movement's leaders, walked straight into Putin's Moscow election headquarters in January 2024 and confronted campaign workers. I'm interested to know when he will issue a decree that my husband has to be home, she demanded. When a campaign worker suggested she pray, Andreeva shot back, "What will I get back? A man without legs, without arms, a sick man?" These women represent something Putin fears more than Ukrainian missiles: the collapse of domestic support for his war. Russian polling shows that about half of respondents support the women's demands for the immediate return of mobilized soldiers. Among Russians aged 18 to 29, support rises to 69%. Even more damaging for Putin, about 60% of Russians oppose a second mobilization. He's running out of people willing to die for his cause. The Kremlin's response has been typically heavy-handed. In May 2024, the Russian Justice Ministry declared the Way Home movement a foreign agent, a label designed to criminalize their activities. They've started detaining journalists who cover the protests. But you can't arrest grief. You can't jail desperation. And you can't silence the growing chorus of Russian voices demanding an end to Putin's war. Because these women have something Putin's propaganda machine can't counter: moral authority. They're not Western-funded dissidents or liberal opposition figures. They're the mothers and wives of the very soldiers Putin claims to be fighting for. And they're calling his war exactly what it is: a pointless slaughter of their loved ones. But the rebellion against Putin goes deeper than battlefield desertions and family protests. It reaches into the very heart of Putin's power structure, and the results have been explosive. June 24th, 2023, a date that will haunt Putin for the rest of his rule. That's when Yevgeny Prigozhin, Putin's former chef turned mercenary boss, did something unprecedented in Putin's 26-year reign. He launched an armed rebellion against the Russian state. Prigozhin's Wagner mercenaries seized the city of Rostov-on-Don, a major military headquarters, then began marching toward Moscow. For about 24 hours, Russia teetered on the brink of civil war as thousands of heavily armed mercenaries drove unopposed toward the capital. Putin's response revealed just how weak his grip on power has become. Instead of crushing the rebellion with overwhelming force, he cut a deal. Prigozhin called off his March of Justice in exchange for safe passage to Belarus. The message was clear: even Putin's most brutal enforcers were turning against him. But Prigozhin wasn't just rebelling. He was exposing the rot at the heart of Putin's war machine. In scathing videos posted before his revolt, he accused Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu and the military leadership of incompetence, corruption, and lying about the war's progress. Most damaging of all, Prigozhin directly challenged the official justifications for the invasion. The war wasn't for demilitarizing or denazifying Ukraine, he declared. It was driven by the personal ambitions of the army leadership. 2 months later, Prigozhin died in a mysterious plane crash. But his rebellion had already shattered Putin's aura of invincibility. For the first time in his rule, Putin had been forced to negotiate with a mutineer. And Prigozhin wasn't the only insider turning against the war. Igor Girkin, a former FSB officer and key architect of Russia's 2014 intervention in Ukraine, became one of Putin's harshest critics. Despite being a hardline nationalist who wanted Russia to defeat Ukraine, Girkin was so disgusted with Putin's war leadership that he began publicly attacking the president. In 2023, Girkin called Putin a cowardly mediocrity and non-entity. He accused Defense Minister Shoigu of incompetence and urged Putin to step aside. This wasn't some liberal opposition figure. This was a man who had helped start Russia's war in Donbass. The Kremlin's response was swift. Girkin was arrested and sentenced to 4 years in prison. But the damage was done. Even Putin's most loyal supporters were publicly questioning his competence. Throughout 2023 and 2024, reports emerged of purges within the Russian military. Generals were fired, demoted, or mysteriously disappeared after criticizing the conduct of the war. In one documented case, General Ivan Popov was reportedly dismissed for complaining that his troops were taking heavy casualties due to lack of support from higher command. The paranoia reached all the way to the top. Putin has concentrated so much power in his own hands that even routine military decisions now require his personal approval. Local officials, terrified of making mistakes, have stopped making decisions altogether. This isn't just political infighting, it's the systematic breakdown of Russia's governing system under the pressure of an unwinnable war. But perhaps the most telling sign of Putin's growing isolation is this: he can no longer hide the scale of his failure from his own people. While Putin's propaganda machine churns out stories about a booming war economy, the reality behind the statistics tells a very different story. Russia is now spending nearly 40% of its federal budget on defense and security, a level of militarization that would make Stalin blush. To put that in perspective, the United States spends about 15% of its budget on defense, and that's considered high by Western standards. But here's the kicker: all that military spending isn't making Russia stronger, it's making it weaker. Putin has essentially turned Russia into a massive military factory, but one that produces nothing but destruction. Russian factories work around the clock manufacturing artillery shells and missiles that get fired into Ukrainian fields. Russian workers build tanks that Ukrainian drones turn into scrap metal within weeks. It's economic suicide disguised as patriotic duty. The human cost is staggering too. Russia faces a labor shortage of 2.6 million people as of the end of 2024, according to Ukrainian intelligence estimates. Young men who should be building Russia's future are either dead in Ukrainian trenches, hiding in basements to avoid conscription, or fled to neighboring countries. Putin's solution? Force undocumented migrants to join the military in exchange for legal status. He's literally recruiting foreigners to die for a war most Russians no longer support. Meanwhile, inflation is crushing ordinary Russian families. Interest rates have been hiked to devastating levels to prevent economic collapse. Non-military businesses are struggling to survive as the state diverts resources to weapons production. Putin promised Russians prosperity through military strength. Instead, he's delivered an economy that only works if it keeps feeding young men into his war machine. And Russians are starting to realize they're not customers in Putin's economy, they're the product being sold. Here's a number that should terrify Putin. 64% of Russians now support starting peace negotiations to end the war in Ukraine. That's according to polling conducted in June 2025, the highest level of support for ending the conflict since the invasion began. Think about what that means in Putin's authoritarian Russia, where criticizing the war can land you in prison. Despite years of nonstop propaganda, despite the threat of arrest, despite the complete control of state media, nearly 2/3 of Russians want this war to end. The shift in public opinion has been dramatic. In early 2022, Putin enjoyed broad support for his special military operation. Russians believed his promises of a quick victory and minimal casualties. They trusted his assurances that Ukraine would welcome Russian soldiers as liberators. More than 3 years later, those illusions have crumbled. Russian cemeteries are filling with fresh graves, while rural regions are being drained of working-age men. In some of Russia's ethnic minority regions, the impact has been devastating. The predominantly Muslim republics of Dagestan and Chechnya, along with the Buddhist majority republic of Tuva, have lost thousands of their young men to Putin's war. Resentment is reportedly simmering as families realize their sons are being used as cannon fodder for Moscow's imperial ambitions. Since Putin's mobilization decree in September 2022, hundreds of thousands of Russian men have fled the country to avoid being drafted. Georgia, Kazakhstan, and other neighboring countries reported massive influxes of Russian refugees, men who would rather abandon their homeland than fight for Putin. One Russian man who escaped to Georgia summed up the sentiment: "I'm not going to die in someone else's insane war. This is not our war." That sentiment is spreading across generations. The economic toll is becoming impossible to ignore as well. Despite Putin's claims of a war economy boom, the reality on the ground tells a different story. Military families are struggling with inflation and shortages. Local governments can't provide basic services because their budgets have been drained by war spending. By 2024, Russia was spending nearly 40% of its federal budget on defense and security, an unsustainable level that's crowding out investment in education, healthcare, and infrastructure. But perhaps most damaging of all is the generational divide that's opening up in Russian society. Young Russians who have grown up with internet access and global connections increasingly reject Putin's imperial nostalgia. They see the war as a pointless waste of their future, and they're voting with their feet by leaving the country in record numbers. Putin's war was supposed to unite Russia behind a common cause. Instead, it's dividing Russian society more deeply than any event since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And that division is about to tear his regime apart. Here's the brutal truth Putin doesn't want to face. His war in Ukraine isn't just failing on the battlefield, it's destroying Russia from within. Every day this war continues, more Russian families turn against him. Every week brings new videos of soldiers refusing to fight. Every month sees fresh protests from wives demanding their husbands' return. Putin launched this invasion believing Russians would rally behind him the way they did after he annexed Crimea in 2014. He thought a quick victory would cement his legacy as the leader who restored Russian greatness. Instead, he's created the very thing he feared most: mass opposition to his rule from ordinary Russians who are tired of sacrificing their lives for his delusions. The numbers don't lie. More than 1 million casualties, 64% support peace talks, record levels of desertion and draft avoidance, mass immigration by young Russians, growing protests by military families. This isn't just war weariness. This is the systematic collapse of public support for Putin's most important policy. And here's what makes it so dangerous for Putin. Unlike previous Russian protests, this rebellion cuts across all of Russian society. It includes soldiers who are supposed to be his most loyal supporters. It includes military families who were supposed to be proud of their sacrifice. It includes regional officials who were supposed to implement his policies without question. When your own soldiers refuse to fight, when military mothers call you a liar, when your closest allies launch armed rebellions, you're not dealing with foreign enemies anymore. You're dealing with the collapse of your own legitimacy. Putin can arrest protesters, he can censor the media, he can threaten his critics with prison or worse. But he can't arrest grief, he can't censor death, and he can't threaten a mother's love for her son. The rebellion against Putin's war started in the trenches of Ukraine, but it's spreading to every corner of Russian society. And once people stop fearing their government, once they start demanding accountability from their leaders, once they realize they have the power to say no, that's when real change becomes inevitable. Putin promised Russians a quick victory and a return to greatness. Instead, he gave them the deadliest war in Russian history and a future filled with grief. The question isn't whether Russians will continue to rebel against Putin's war. The question is how long Putin can survive the rebellion he created. So what do you think? Are we witnessing the beginning of the end for Putin's regime, or will he find new ways to force Russians to die for his imperial ambitions? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to Fall of Nations for more deep dives into the stories that are reshaping our world.